sometimes people arrive late, so I know Anna Lee sent me a message that she wasn't going to be there today, so that's okay. So I don't mind saying this. So today we're going to be talking mostly about the first half, right? Really focusing on the first half of the wars. Even if everyone had finished the wars for today, I think it makes more sense to kind of cover it over two classes just because it is a novel, right? My ideas were bigger than my reality or my expectations of reality. So I mostly focused a lot of my notes on the first half, right? I might talk a little bit about what we expect going forward, but yeah, that'll be the focus. But of course, before this, did you all see that I put up the comments for the first essay? Okay, so it's the first time that I do things directly into Moodle, so I wasn't sure if you were actually able to see it. Hi, Brittany. So overall, hi, Mark. Very well done. I think most people's grades gravitated somewhere between like 75 and 85, more or less, right? So I can't complain. And as promised, I now have a better sense of where to give you indications for the second and third one. Okay. I'm not going to repeat every single comment that I had for your essays just because that would be redundant, and I put them either in the text itself or in the sidebar. But there are a couple of recommendations that I think going forward bear repeating, even if I did mention it in your individual essays for some of you. The first one is that for any writer, think of your reader as an idiot, right? And I mean that in the not in the more abstract sense, right? Don't baby your reader. That's not what I'm saying, right? Using simple terms or anything like that. But what I mean is your reader is not in your mind, right? I think a lot of your teachers do that as well, right? Inevitably. Why do teachers explain things or perhaps over-explain things that are obvious for some people but less for others? Because we don't know what's going on, what you're thinking, right? So we explain things assuming that you do not know things. Okay? And I think a lot of your essays could be improved by thinking of that. Okay? And this, by the way, applies to any writers. Whether it's in literature or archaeology or history, whatever it is. Okay? And even if you want some really good examples, not only can I give you some if you really want some, both within or outside of class, but you could probably actually just look up an article on JSTOR or whatever database you have access to. And most published articles, if you take one at random, will do this if you want a good example of this. Okay? So structurally, I'm just looking at my notes real quick. Structurally, I think a lot of your essays were really good. Your introductions laid out your main topics, your main ideas. You then went on to elaborate on a lot of really interesting stuff, both stuff that we have seen in class and some of your own ideas. Okay? Keep going on that. That's fantastic stuff. Okay? I encourage you to do this. That is basically what you're supposed to do. And you'll have noticed that in a lot of the essays, what I said was basically do that, but go deeper. Okay? I think as a class, because you have so many good ideas, you're really going to benefit from the later essays, where you're going to have a little bit more space, where you'll be able to develop on your ideas in the way that they deserve. Okay? But of course, I didn't want to give you all 3 essays that were 1,500 words each. I don't think that would have been feasible for the class. Okay, so I inevitably forced you to be very concise for this first one, but overall, I think well done. Anything else I wanted to say or add on to? Yeah, so part of the reason why I said, okay, treat your reader like an idiot because they're not in your mind is because a lot of the way that you write, and I say you as a general classroom, some of you it applies more than others, will go from one idea to another as if it's obvious. Right? It makes sense in your mind. I have no doubt about that. Okay? And I know that because I have also fallen into that trap, right, as a writer. Okay? It's something that has plagued me as a writer literally until this year. And my supervisor still continues to give me those comments sometimes. Okay? It sometimes, I'll start that sentence over again. It slips all of our minds that we are often writing for someone else and not for ourselves. Okay? What is that noise, by the way? Does anyone know?
It's my computer.
Oh, okay. Sorry, because it showed up in other classes as well, and I was wondering. Okay, so yeah, imagining what the other reader knows, or putting yourself literally in the reader's shoes, I think will very much help you with your transitions to explain one idea to the next. I tried to highlight these areas wherever possible in your essay comments. If you want more specific feedback, or if you want to talk about your essay specifically, I am more than happy to discuss it. I'm actually even willing to discuss it if you feel like you've been unjustly graded for your essay. I'm happy to have a conversation with that. Just be sure to come to me with valid arguments as to why you think you deserve a better grade than this. Okay? I think I was overall fair, but I'm not just going to give you a better grade because you ask kindly. Okay? I wish it were that easy. Yeah, exactly. Add a couple more pleases and then Does that make sense for everyone? Yeah. I hope we were not all disappointed with our essays. No. Okay. Good. Oh yes, final thing. Sorry, and then we can actually get into the wars. One of the things that I mentioned in a few essays, not all of them, was that you should focus less on summarizing and more on analyzing. Okay? Again, there's nothing wrong with summarizing. Generally speaking, this will be, again, easier for the second and third essays that are longer. Try to put the summaries that you need, right, or the generalizations that you need in your introductions. Right? You set the groundwork as much as possible in your introduction, and then you can focus on the analysis and the kind of minutia in your development sections. Not everyone respects this. This is my personal recommendation for you. I think structurally that's what makes most sense for writers. All right. I'm glad that I see heads nodding. So that's good. Does anyone have any questions on anything, whether it's something I brought up or not? Okay. Good. So I already asked a few people. For those of you who arrived late, how many of you did you at least manage to get to half of the wars? Ish? No. Did you read enough of it to kind of get some of the ideas? No. Mark, anything? Okay. Billy?
I feel like I read enough not to know what's happening.
Not to know what's happening. Okay.
Like I did get good
Sure.
chunk into it, just
it's
not rapid.
I remember that. That's a really good one.
I wrote 2 essays this weekend, so.
No, okay. So the only reason I'm asking, I mentioned this before half the class arrived. I pretty much decided to separate the wars into 2 classes anyway. I think it'll make more sense, both for people who didn't have time to finish it, and because it's a novel, so it'll make more sense to just take our time with it. Right? Contrary to the play or the poetry, that's just very easy to get it all done in 3 hours. And also because as a book, And I think what Billy, you just said, really indicates that this is probably a book that rewards having some background knowledge to it. Okay? Or at least an explanation to ground ourselves so that as we move forward into the novel, we get more and more of the references or of what Findley is actually trying to do with this novel. Does that mean that you will be completely lost if you don't have that context? No. I think the fact that this was a popular novel in its time demonstrates the fact that there was a certain kind of openness to it, right? That it was meant for a general audience. Part of that is because it rewards that, and also because at the time there were still people alive who had participated in the First World War. So that context was not so far removed for a shocking amount of people. And of course, that's something that we're going to talk about either this week or next week, but there is literally no one left. I think the last person died officially, at least in North America, who would have experienced anything like this. So this is quite literally a text that is describing and trying to attempt to understand an experience that no one can understand anymore. And that's a weird thing for a text to do. I'm not criticizing the text for it. It's just a kind of heavy burden that is put on the text inevitably. Right? Because a World War II text would still have some people who were around, fewer and fewer, but still some. Right? Whereas this, we've completely abandoned that hope. Yes, go ahead, Billy.
Like, I got, like, a good chunk in, but
Yeah.
I just felt like, when I'm reading it, like, if there's no connection, which I find that harder to read, which that's pretty standard. If you're not connecting to the book, you're not.
That's
like,
just the first little bit, and then it starts to make a lot more sense.
oh, so you start to read.
Yeah. Just accept that you will understand,
And then
push through, and then it starts to feel like.
Okay.
No, but I'm going to. I get what you're saying. I am going to write it down though. Do you mean no connection between the segments?
Like, kind of just what it's trying to tell you. Like,
Okay.
in the book. Because, like I'm reading it, and it's like, I try and, like, imagine what would be happening, and there's no imagining.
Interesting.
It drops you in the middle.
Yeah. So, do you remember what the term was for dropping you in the middle?
Media.
You got a third of it. Yeah, media is one of them. In media res, right? So that was the term that we talked about. A lot of books surprisingly do this. Kind of drop you in the middle of some action, right? Because otherwise we would just start at the Big Bang or whatever, if you wanted to really start at the beginning. But there's a difference between actually starting in the middle of something and giving you the feeling of starting in the middle of something. Okay? This always makes me think, going back to Aristotle, right? If anyone has ever read his Poetics, right, which is a kind of reconstructed text, we only have bits and pieces of it. But one of the things that people often come back to in that text is that he thinks about story structure. And he says a text has to have a beginning, middle, and end. And when you first read that, you're like, yeah, no, Aristotle, of course a text has to have a beginning, middle, and end. That's how I read stories, you moron, right? But then you think about it for a second, and what he means is it has to have the feeling of beginning, the feeling of middle, and the feeling of ending. And we're not going to talk about like the aesthetics of that necessarily in this class, but I think it is something that you should keep in the back of your mind, that when a text does drop you in the middle, right, in media res, it is simultaneously a literal beginning of one story, inevitably, right, because we are starting from page 1, or page whatever Roman numeral, if you're reading a preface. But it has the feeling of the middle. If a text like this one, and I think you're right on the money on this, Billy, if a text like Findley's gives you the feeling of starting in the middle and is disconcerting, it's not a coincidence, right? This was, I don't think it was his first novel. I should have looked this up, but it was certainly an early novel of his. But by then, Findley had written other things, right? Whether it was novels, film scripts, and so on. So he had an awareness of story structure and how to tell a story. Okay? So any deviations from this have to be assumed as intentional. Yeah. On some level. Does that mean you have to appreciate it and like it? No. No. You can dislike a text that does that, right? Because that comes down to personal preference at some point. But I do encourage you at the very least to consider why he's doing this and what effect that has. Does that? I'm not saying that helps you necessarily understand what's going to happen, but it should at least ease you into it. Give it time.
Keep reading.
Yes. Sometimes that is just what you have to do. You just power through. And usually something clicks at some point, right? You understand a turn of phrase that just locks everything into place, and it'll make everything else smooth sailing. Right? I get this a lot when I read philosophy texts, which doesn't happen very often, right? But when I really don't understand a text, usually I try to give it time, and somewhere it locks in. There's like a way that the author explained it that suddenly, boom. Not that I'm saying this is the equivalent of reading Kant or whatever, but same principle. Now I actually am curious if it was his first novel. I don't think so. While I'm looking this up for the sake of my own personal interest and no one else's, I want you to consider the quote that I put up here on the board. Okay. There we go. Oh, no, not what I wanted. So I found, like a lot of the quotes and references that okay, it was his third novel, by the way. So yeah, he was already well versed in story structure at that point. So one of the texts that I've been reading recently is a poetry collection by B.P. Nichol, who was a well-known poet right around the time that Findley was writing. And in one of his texts, he starts off with this quote by Gertrude Stein, whom he had a kind of great poetic admiration for. Gertrude Stein, who herself was a modernist poet, very well known. I think I've mentioned her in passing in this class before. And at the beginning of one of B.P. Nichol's poetry collections, he uses this as an epigraph. Let me recite what history teaches. History teaches. Which may seem very flippant, right? And kind of Gertrude Stein being like, ha ha, I'm kind of clever right now, right? And in many ways, yes. She is being clever and on the nose with it. But the reason why I'm starting with this specific quote is I think Findley is specifically working against this idea. Okay? There's an implied assumption about history that Gertrude Stein is working with here. Before I tell you, I'm going to let you take a guess as to what I'm implying here. What is Gertrude Stein's assumption about history in this quote?
We would learn something from our history.
Not only that we would learn something, which is not at all a given, as evidenced by, just you observing the world around you. I'm sure you see a lot of situations where people should have learned from history and have not. Right? So that's absolutely one of the things that she's thinking of. Yeah. Okay, so bit of an assumption that kind of that what we've talked about with Lorena Gale's text a little bit, where history, capital H, shapes human action. Right? That quote that I gave you earlier of we're all individuals, but none of us actually make history individual. We're inevitably tied to this web of history, right? Other people, other countries, other ideas, etc., and so forth. But I think exactly that. Not only that history with a capital H, in this case, literally, just by the benefit of being a full sentence, is something that has power on its own, right? Power to teach, as if it were in front of a classroom giving a lecture, but also as something that is narrativized in a way that is cohesive enough to teach. Okay? Now, this is not me dunking on any idea of having such a thing as history classes, right? I think they are wildly important and that history should be taught. Okay? But inevitably, Gertrude Stein's quote in this is that there's a certain standard of history, right, to teach. And I think, I think you get this pretty early on in the text, even if you haven't finished it, or even if you haven't gotten halfway through it, that Findley thinks this is crap, to put it bluntly. Right? That there is a lot about history that comes down to the way that we tell it, right? And who tells it, and what exactly about history we decide to focus on. Does anyone remember what the term I used for that was? This self-consciousness about history. I don't blame you if you do. I mentioned it in passing last week, and we've had a whole weekend since then. So
Are you talking about historiographic?
That's half of it.
Fiction?
Yeah, there you go. Thank you for providing me with a segue. Yeah, so historiographic metafiction. I mentioned it last week in full expectation that we were going to talk about this novel this week. It's called Setup and Payoff. So, for those of you who need a brief reminder, historiographic metafiction as a term was coined by a Canadian author, actually, a theorist, called Linda Hutcheon, whose most famous work was called The Canadian Postmodern. And it was basically a work of literary theory that examines different authors, like Timothy Findley and Robert Croach from Alberta, and so on and so forth. Just a bunch of authors that were contemporary to her moment when she wrote that text in the early 80s. And it was obviously Hutcheon's way of engaging with a certain kind of postmodernism. Now, I've bandied this text around a few times, this term around a few times, but for those of you who need a crash course, one of the ways that the postmodern expresses itself is, to put it very, very succinctly, in this suspicion of narrative. This is not going to become a whole class on postmodernism, so that's like the most succinct way that I can put it for all of the implications that that has. That there is no such thing as a clear and linear narrative, that the idea even of a stable truth, right, is kind of dicey. Not that there are no facts. There's a difference. Okay. This table is made of cheap wood. That's a fact, right? That's not what we're talking about here. A postmodernist wouldn't come up and say, well, actually, it's not quite that if you look at it from a certain perspective, blah, blah, blah. That's not what we're saying. Okay. Usually what postmodern people are concerned with is how we actually approach that truth and what we make of it, right? Which inevitably makes our perceptions of reality, story, the world, politics, whatever you want to talk about, slippery. There you go. I just gave you a crash course history on postmodernism.
There's no reliable narrator.
Yeah, no reliable narrator is a really good one. A lot of people will say that postmodernism, by its very name, but also by what it's trying to do, is a logical successor to the moderns that Gertrude Stein was definitely a part of. Right? She's getting at something, right? She and her compatriots in the modernists, you brought up before class, Mel Virginia Woolf, for example, will get at these ideas, and the postmodernists will just take them into overdrive. So I got this quote here from Hutchins' Canadian Postmodern, which gets at what historiographic metafiction tries to do, and I think hits at why it's a subcategory or an extension of postmodernism more broadly. And she writes that historiographic metafiction attempts to make the reader aware of how history is made by its writer, even if the events seem to speak for themselves. Actually, this is a really good example, right? I assume that the class before us in this classroom is some kind of like Western Civ class or something like that, just based off of what's on it every week. What kind of, for those of you who can see, maybe it'll be harder for those of you in the back of the class, right? But let's see. So we have this timeline with an emphasis on Montesquieu, for example, so French philosopher from the 16th century, I want to say, and Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, then a bunch of things on economics. Got a bit of a quote from Benedict Anderson in the corner over there, Imagined Communities. And then it keeps going and going. We have the Tsars at the very end of this timeline. So it's roughly a timeline from the 1750s to the 1900s. So for those of you who are good at math, you'll notice that's like 150 years of history condensed into, let's be generous and say 50 terms. Now, I'm sure the teacher who was giving this class is great at their job, right? I'm not, again, dunking on them. But to get to Linda Hutchins' point, there's inevitably a selection process going on here. Okay? While the individual facts of these people's existence, or even these texts' existence, there's a few mentions here and there of civil disobedience and the encyclopedias and all of that are developing. The choice of these people and ideas gives a certain perspective of history. Okay? That cannot be separated from any kind of ideological background or personal background or even societal background. I just took a really easy example here because of what was there. But does that track so far for everyone? Awesome. Okay. I had a few more quotes here on my computer. Most of my notes for today's class are on my computer just because we have a larger class to talk about.
There was nothing in the folder for today, is it because we were talking about the wars? Okay.
Yeah. Which again, if you have a digital copy of it, that's totally fine.
I just got one.
Yeah. Cool, as one does. So Hutchins' quote that I put here emphasizes the writer. Other thinkers like Hayden White around this time would really emphasize the idea of history as a narrative, okay, very much like a novel, right, to oversimplify his argument. But even though Hutchins is coming at this from a critical theory perspective, historiographic metafiction can also be, of course, taken up by fiction writers, as the name implies. So we have essentially in this book a novel that not only really puts a lot of sway onto the writer himself, although we don't know who the narrator of the text is, right? But you can assume, I think you get this from the start, that there's some kind of archivist or historian of some kind, someone who is trying to piece together some thing about Robert Ross's past. And they have to work with what they have, right? Photos, interviews, etc. But the rest of it has to be filled in. How do you fill that in? By creating a novel like The Wars. So not only is history made by its writer, both historically and in a fictional sense, but also the fiction that Hutchins is describing, right, is fiction that is self-reflective, right? This is a text that knows it is a text, that knows it is a text about a historical moment, and auto-representational. This is another term that Linda Hutchins uses. Okay. Not only does it know it's a historical fiction, but it very much puts that front and center, right? I am a historical creation, right? Both in being, from our perspective as readers, published in the past, this was written 50 years ago, but also being about the past, very explicitly about the past, right? In talking about something that at the time of its publication had happened 60 years prior. Right? So there's a kind of double historicizing going on from at least where we're standing. How many of you did I lose just now? No one. Fantastic. I'm so proud of myself. Okay. Any questions on historiographic metafiction before I move on? This is not supposed to be a theory-heavy class. I just think it's inevitably going to be a part of this conversation, so I wanted to bring this up. Okay. You are no longer allowed to ask any questions about Linda Hutchins' concept. We are moving on and never talking about it again. So why am I talking about historiographic metafiction? Part of what makes Findley's novel so powerful and so recognized, both at the time and today, right? At the time, it won Canada's most prestigious literary award. It won the Governor General's Award the year it came out. Right? And if you get the new copy, it very much proudly demonstrates this. Right? This is a national treasure of a book, is basically what that little indication says. Right? This is an institutionally recognized piece of literature. In this case, rightfully so. But something we kind of forget, because we're so used to these types of narratives now, is that Findley was very much responding to a perception about World War I that was still dogging the Canadian consciousness at that moment. And in many ways, still does, despite the increase in stories that very much put the horrors of war front and center. I'm just thinking, for example, of the recent adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front, right? That was quite successful. Or what's it called? The Christopher Nolan one. Dunkirk, right? Which I hear is visceral. Right? Never saw it myself, but really wants you to know these people went through hell. 1917 was a recent World War I movie. Oppenheimer, of course. All of these, I'm just using movie examples, but all of these want you to know that these men at the front were not having a good time. No shocker there for us. But Findley is operating in a moment where the perception about World War I was still a heroic one in the traditional sense of that term. When I say the word hero, what comes to mind for people? What does that mean?
Brave.
Okay, good. Bravery.
Soldier.
Okay, exactly, right? So, a brave soldier. Do we have any respect? Good. Command?
PTSD.
Okay. Do you usually associate a hero with someone who has trauma?
Yeah.
Now? Okay, interesting. Do we have any examples of what a hero might be? Say from like contemporary standpoints, right? If I ask you to give me an example, a clear example of someone who everyone would be like, yes, obviously that's a hero. I gave some examples last week, I think, that we could all say unequivocally would be heroes. Because we still use the term very prevalently. Yeah, good. Superheroes, right? They make billions of dollars in the cinema. Comic books less so, right? But still, right? They're popular both in their literary form as comic books and in cinema fiction. And again, I love superhero movies, right? I grew up with them. I still read them today as comic books, right? They're fantastic because they're escapism to a T, right? I will read Superman punching Brainiac every single month, right? It's fantastic. But it is a very specific idea of what a hero should be. Okay? Last week I talked about it in the sense of the hero always has to win at the end, okay? Or usually has to win. But we can also consider it in the sense of how we conventionally imagine a protagonist. Right? Superman is Superman because he doesn't have any flaws. He's big, strong, handsome, whatever. He always knows the right thing to do. Okay? This is, of course, something that can be very positive from a storytelling perspective. There's a reason why we've been using these tropes for literally centuries. Right? Homer's The Odyssey is all about exactly these heroes. Okay? From our perspective, they're a little bit flawed because there's all kinds of stuff that we find unsavory, but that the Greeks would just think were normal. But the basic concepts of what a hero is basically remain the same. Okay? When we say brave soldiers who command respect, you could have basically described Achilles right there. Okay? So it makes for engaging reading. Protagonist. Because we imagine ourselves in those steps right there, an ideal to live up to. But it can also be an extremely negative thing. Okay? Getting into the wars. It can be an extremely negative thing because PTSD is a thing, and we'll come back to this specifically in relation to World War One. Why else might it be a negative thing to have such an idea of heroes, aside from masking things like trauma?
I think it puts them in a certain box, like they can't waver in certain directions. They're stuck on a straight, like the moral compass leads them in a certain direction.
Good.
I think it adds pressure.
Yeah, good. Pressure is good. If you do not do these things, you are a bad soldier. You're a coward. Right? You don't deserve respect. And again, not necessarily in the military context, but you see this in all kinds of situations. Yeah. I have certain standards about, I don't know, what my parents should have or should be. Right? And if they don't respect those standards, they have failed. So this is just one example of standards, except the difference with the hero standard is that people literally die. Any other? So PTSD, pressure, self-imposed limitations. Anything else that we can think of? A lot of this can kind of extend out from pressure.
Compassion.
I'm sorry?
Compassion.
So a lack of, or?
There is, as they go see.
Okay, so there's the expectation to have compassion, right? And that comes into, I guess, as an extension, expectation.
I think this whole hero idea feeds into the idea of toxic masculinity.
Mhm.
Because there's this expectation that men would be a certain way, look a certain way, behave a certain way.
Yeah. So very toxic. And this is why, by the way, you also see, right, because in the military, we still have these ideas, even in the 21st century. I say that as someone who has worked in military scenarios, right, not as a soldier myself, but in that field, broadly speaking, and who has encountered in their life on multiple occasions people who were either in the military or adjacent to it. So you still see this very prevalently. And even now, in the 21st century, we have women, right, who are in the military. You still see a lot of situations where these women end up replicating these toxic scenarios because the overarching, like, heroic model is so prevalent. Right? That's not me saying that there shouldn't be women, whatever. I think you get what I'm saying.
No, like the only way for a woman soldier, supposedly, to get respect would be to fit herself into this box.
In the really more pervasive sense, and it doesn't obviously apply to World War I specifically, but it does get us to start thinking about why the novel's title is pluralized. But there's a lot of fascist undertones to these ideas. We're not going to get into it right now. This is more a conversation for tomorrow once we're addressing the novel as a whole, right, or the second half of the novel. But you can broadly discuss this in the context of the kind of aestheticization of violence that fascists, past and present, really prioritize. Right? The idea itself of the Übermensch, right, that the Nazis, the historical Nazis, right, took to heart, comes from this, and a hyper distortion and elevation of this model. Right? Now, again, I should really emphasize, I don't think that automatically when you're a soldier, you're a fascist, right? That's not what I'm saying. Right? For example, my grandfather was in World War II, right? I've never met him. He died like decades before I was born from a heart attack. But from what I heard, he was not that kind of person, right? His brother also. But the line from soldier to fascist, right, or the ideals is not that far, is what I'm saying. Are you pursing your lips because you disagree with me?
No,
Okay.
my husband is in the military.
Right. Okay. Good. So you would agree, right? Unless.
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
100%.
Oh no, I married a fascist. I shouldn't say. Just, when does it become appropriate to make a joke about things like that? I don't know.
When
But
you spent a week with me, do you think I would marry a fascist?
no. I was just thinking out loud. Anyway, doesn't matter. But yeah, my point is to emphasize, right, that the relation between one and the other is not that far. Which is all to say that this questioning of what a hero is and what that entails was something that the modernists before Findley and his generation were considering. One need only to read Eliot's The Wasteland, right, to have that sense of what exactly the impact of war is, right? Both on individuals and the world around us. Right? So you start to see this questioning actively. Right? But on an institutional and a societal level, you still see a holding on to these very powerful ideas. And the example I picked up on is how much we emphasize poems still to this day, like John McCrae's In Flanders Fields. A poem that is so prevalent that I would not be surprised if many of you here could at least recite the first 2 lines, if not the entire poem. I see some heads nodding yes. You're probably going through it right now, right? In Flanders Fields, the poppies grow between the crosses through a long row, blah, blah, blah. Because you see it every single year, right? Around November 11th, right? Someone's going to post it on their Facebook page, right? Your aunt, or it's going to be on a poster or something. Right? And it's a fine poem. But the fact that it's been so anthologized and so put forward, right? This elevation, right, to literally a mythical and iconic status of this World War I poem that glorifies the dead in Europe, right? And their sacrifice goes a long way to tell you how much these narratives of heroism in war are still very prevalent. And for those of you who didn't know, In Flanders Fields was written for a World War I scenario.
I keep jumping ahead.
Yeah, please.
But just thinking about like the hero and stuff like that. But I think like like I said, this is way far ahead, I'm sure. But like I keep thinking about anti-heroes or reluctant heroes. That is like I think that's super popular nowadays.
Yeah, and especially in popular fiction, you see this emerging. I would say in like the 70s, right? Late 60s, 70s. You have
like that Vietnam War era. That was where like the soldiers didn't want to be there, but they're so heroic, and they came back and like I mean Rambo did this in movies, and then now like sort of Deadpool, like, all these anti-heroes are just super popular.
Exactly. There's almost you can almost make an argument that they started off as a radical thing and then they became, right, again, very institutionalized, right? Where I don't know. I was going to make like a Charles Bronson reference, but no one's going to get that one in this case. Yeah, I don't know. But like, right when Charles Bronson was making these kinds of anti-hero movies in the 70s. You can look them up. They're not particularly good, but yeah, Rambo. Yeah, Sylvester Stallone in Rambo is a very good example, actually, because they still make those movies somehow, right? And the point, if you look at that first one, right, the first Rambo movie, the guy has PTSD, right? Like that's what makes that movie still so interesting today. Is not that it's an action-heavy movie. It isn't. Right? Most of the action takes place in the last 15 minutes of that movie as Sylvester Stallone's Rambo is basically spiraling out of control because of the PTSD that he's facing from World War One. The Vietnam War, right?
And like no movies or media were really showing this,
Right.
And that's why it became a huge cultural
Exactly.
problem.
But that same character in the latest Rambo is purely a military show. He goes into third world countries and does basically what I was criticizing last time about the US doing in Venezuela not that long ago, right? The last one was literally him going into Myanmar and shooting a bunch of people just for US interests.
This is a whole conversation how media is becoming more fascist.
100%. I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yeah.
Right?
Like you got Robin Hood, Disney movie in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and now it's bunnies and police uniforms.
Right. But just the idea that Robin Hood is a movie made by Disney, the fact that doesn't immediately create a black hole in the universe, right? By the sheer irony of that is insane. Right? There you go. I've done my little anti-capitalist waving flag for the day, right? We can all rest easy tonight. But as much as I admire the attempts to create these anti-heroes, right? I think, Mark, you're right that there is a lot of radical potential in that. Right? It is very interesting that we inevitably keep coming back to this. Because on some level, we do like it. There's a reason why Marvel movies make $1 billion each. Right? On some level, we find that satisfying. Right? I'm not a fascist, but I love Batman. So cool. Because we've aestheticized it. Right? Where was I? Did you have a question or you just wanted to stretch your legs? Okay. Okay. I'll stop ranting. So, okay. Yeah, so one, in Flanders Fields is the example of how basically Findley needs to respond to a specific historical narrative that we've set up. And I should have looked this up again before class, but I will now just so I have it in front of me. When was Findley born?
1930.
1930. Okay, so between the two world wars. He would have certainly been old enough by the time World War II started that he would have been at least aware of it. Right? He would have been 9 when it broke out, 10 by the time it reached North America or something. When was Pearl Harbor? 41, so 11 maybe. So he would have been old enough to know and experience on some level the war effort. But what he would have known from the First World War is what probably his father told him. Right? So those stories kind of inevitably passed down. By then, we had already very much, by 1930 and by World War II, we had very much created this mythologization in Canada, just to bring it back to our current topic, of places like Vimy Ridge. Right? Which, by the way, was an active kind of propaganda push, right, to make this part of our national mythology. And how many times do you still hear that today? Right? Oh, World War I was the time when Canada truly came into its own. Right? We became a nation because we started fighting for ourselves during World War I. How many of you have heard that before? Just a show of hands. Right? Okay, so I see some heads nodding. Good, about half of you. And I guess, from a historical perspective, it can be definitely true. Right? From a certain vantage point. But again, that very much muddies the lived experience of the war. Where the dead that McRae is talking about are quote-unquote rightfully sacrificed in favor of a national mythology that is being formed. Right? We are building this nation. If that means thousands of people dying in France, so be it. It was a moment of unity when we all came together. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Findley wrote this right around the Vietnam War era as well.
Like, wasn't this like Canada's first real conflict after being united? Like, like the railroads was complete, like the country was connected. So then, like, we went together and we are a unified nation, contributing to the good.
You mean World War One?
Yeah.
Yeah. So technically, we were still part of the British Empire at that point, right? We hadn't signed things like the Westminster Treaty, which gave us a little bit more independence. But part of the narrative is that things like World War One, where Canada often fought as an individual battalion, right? Even if it was technically under the aegis of the British Empire, that it paved the way for further independence, like the Treaty of Westminster in 1931, and the fact that in the Second World War we signed our own declarations of wars. Right? So this kind of trail of mini independences, if you will. But I think you're absolutely right, Mark. Okay, I'm just looking here. What else did I have? Okay, so after that it's the epigraphs. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about in this first part of class before getting into the text specifically is less the war context, okay, which I'm happy to answer questions of. I'm assuming certain things about World War One, and I think you're all following so far. But if you want to ask further questions about like my thought process on this, that's totally fine. But one of the things that I think should also be highlighted, in part because of what's brought up in the novel, is the more political context of World War One that should be noted. So we mentioned in previous classes the Victorian era, right, and what its literary interests were. Technically, by World War One, we're no longer in the Victorian era. Right, Queen Vicky died in. I say Queen Vicky as if I was best friends with the one with her. Yeah, Vicky and I, we had tea every Sunday. I'm that old. So Victoria died in 1901, and her son took over, right, Edward, initiating the so-called Edwardian era, which basically lasted for about 10 years before war broke out, and basically everything collapsed in on itself.
Did he die?
I forget when he died exactly, but I think it was in like 1912 or something like that. 1910. Wow. Okay, so he was old by the time. Yeah, 1910, and then his son took over. I think George V. Yeah, but it's still called the Edwardian era, broadly speaking, because after that you get into the Jazz Age, and that's where things like the Great Gatsby comes in, and then you get the Great Depression, and everyone's sad again. But the Edwardian era is, in many ways, very similar to the Victorian era, insofar as we have these rather conservative moral values that do legislate a lot of society. We briefly talked about this with the Victorians. The reason why people like Jack the Ripper, which I think you, Moon, brought up, clash so much is because it completely contradicts our image of the Victorian ideal, right, of prim and proper people, right? Edwardians get a little bit looser with this. It is the era of modernism, after all, but there's still quite a bit of, conservatively repressive social mores. The perfect example that I can give of this is Oscar Wilde, right? Do we all know at least the name of Oscar Wilde? Right. Respected in his time as a writer, right? And you can see in his plays and his texts that you're starting to see people play a little bit with what's acceptable in the stories that we tell. Right? So Wilde had Yeah, and famously, the importance of being earnest, for example. These kind of sexual undertones in his stories and puns and wordplay that were a bit cheeky, right? But you couldn't push it too far. There was still a lot of censorship about what you could do. Same thing for someone like D.H. Lawrence, who was writing more or less around the same time and mostly a little bit later. So very much still hidden, right? But we're starting to push the envelope. And the reason why I single out Oscar Wilde in particular at this time is because his envelope pushing went a little bit too far for the era. Pop quiz, what happened to Oscar Wilde, for those of you who know? Oh, really? Okay.
He died.
Well, yes. He did die. He died in did he die in prison? He went to prison, certainly.
It was like a decency situation.
What is indecency a euphemism for?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exposing himself.
Yeah, so he was a homosexual, right, at the time. Well, he would have been today also, but so he was a homosexual, and his problem, so to speak, right, quote unquote, is that it was found out, right? To make a long story short, he basically had an affair, or was having an affair, with a high-ranked member of the British aristocracy, right? With the son of a high-ranking member of the British aristocracy, and it was found out, and that member basically blackmailed him and say, either you go to prison or like I will ruin your life, basically. And yeah,
We found out about this fast.
yeah, I don't really feel like getting into it, but it was a whole thing of, there was a letter that was found by Wilde to his lover, and it was basically used as blackmail, and it was a whole thing, right? And it became, we talked about the O.J. Simpson trial last week. That was basically the trial of the century at the time, right? It was very publicized, and the entire linchpin was that this very famous writer was gay, which today we would think nothing of, right? Or very few people would make a big deal out of it.
When was it?
This would have been in it was just before the of the turn of the century. Hold on, it was like either the 1890s or early 20th century. Oscar Wilde trial. Did you look it up? Sorry.
Oh, I just said.
No.
You said Timothy was gay. Yeah, Timothy was also gay.
Yes. So that you are preceding me in that sense, but yeah, Timothy Findley is gay, or was gay as well.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, 1895. Yeah, so just on that cusp. Yeah, he was convicted to 2 years. Died not long after, 1900. But all this to say, right? So you see this kind of back and forth, right? Of what's acceptable in society, kind of, and unacceptable. I say this in part to foreground, right? Timothy Findley was gay, which is not the reason necessarily why, for those of you who read that far, there are the scenes of homosexuality in this, right? He's written just because you're a gay writer doesn't mean that you have to write gay stuff, right? There is homosexuality in this novel, but it's more based off of the context of the book, right? Because it happens in the early years of the 20th century, the reasons why characters act the way that they do in relation to this homosexuality and to this idea of masculinity is because of the social mores at the time. I think overall it treats homosexuality quite well, right? Overall, in some respects, one occasion better than the other, without spoiling the ending.
I don't think that the other one was about homosexuality.
No.
So
it was not. But yeah, I think despite obviously Findley's own homosexuality, right? He's looking at what the standard reaction to homosexuality at the time would have been, and he incorporates that, I think, quite well into the book. I think that's the most context I've ever given for a book. Does anyone have any questions? Was this helpful a little bit for providing context? Yeah. I'm looking at you, Billy, because you're the one who brought it up. But does that help at least frame some of the elements? Okay. I'm sorry? Yeah, please.
It says here that Timothy was married to.
Uh-huh. Yes. Mhm. So it was illegal to marry same-sex people at the time. So you see this in a lot of situations, and you still see this in some countries today, where people who are homosexual or lesbian, whatever you want to term, part of the LGBTQ world, right, will often end up having to marry members of the opposite sex, right, to put up appearances for some of it. Right? Yeah, I actually don't know what his relationship with his wife was. I think they were friends. Right? Like they actually did respect themselves, but I think on some level that would have been part of why they were married. And in fact, this is something that we can discuss further, but the wars at the time, while we do think of the late 70s when this novel came out as a time where it was becoming much more accepted for homosexuality to be a thing, this novel faced a lot of censorship attempts. Never successful, right? But it did face a lot of attempts both by Findley's editor at the time, who wanted him to cut some of the sexual components of it, and later interest groups who, for example, didn't want it taught in schools, or who wanted it to be limited to a certain age group because of its sexual components. Findley himself would claim censorship on that one. Right? This is not me fabulating or interpreting the scenario. Findley, I'm not entirely sure if I agree with his qualification, but he referred to the censorship of books as a form of rape, as a form of literary rape, and that's, I think, a very strong word. Although rhetorically it makes some sense considering the novel. I understand what he's going for, but I'm still on the fence about his articulation of that idea. Right? So he was very outspoken against the attempts at censoring the text, both before and after its publication. Yeah, any other questions aside from that? Okay. What time is it? So 7:10. Does it make sense? Do we want to take a break now, or do we want to... It doesn't make sense. Do we want to take a break now, or do we want to at least do the epigraphs and take a break? It's a little bit early for a break. Usually I take one around 7:30, but... Okay. So regardless of how far you went into the book, I assume you all got to the epigraphs at the very least? Okay, good. So there's two. Oddly enough, not on the same page, which is unusual for a text. The first one is, of course, by Euripides. Never that which is shall die. Did I put it up here? Yes. And the second one, 2 pages later. In such dangerous things as war, the errors which proceed from a spirit of benevolence are the worst. By von Clausewitz.
Which is a required reading in the current Canadian Armed Forces.
Von Clausewitz? Really? Why?
I just know that it is.
Huh. Interesting. Did everyone hear that?
No.
Okay. So von Clausewitz, apparently, according to Mel, is required reading in the Canadian Armed Forces. Do you know which text specifically? Like that, the one that this is from? Or I'm asking purely out of curiosity in this case.
Is it called On War?
I assume so, unless he wrote different texts on it. I didn't look up his entire bibliography.
Because the name was familiar, and so I asked my husband if he had read it, and he said, yeah, because it's required reading.
Right, okay. Yeah, it probably is because that's his, like, seminal work. Yeah, is considered a seminal treatise on military strategy and science. Interesting that it's still read today. Wow. Good to know, I guess.
That and Marcus Aurelius Meditations.
Yeah, probably also like Sun Tzu or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Okay. So let's start with Euripides. Never that which is shall die. So, as all good epigraphs, right, tells you something about the text even before you've started reading it. It's kind of pre-reading, if you will. Okay? So before, and actually I might focus on the people who haven't read the text, but even the people who have finished it or have finished most of it, when you first read this, what does it trigger in your mind as an expectation or as an immediate thought process? For me, it ties most explicitly, even if it's not the only answer, but it ties most explicitly to the title itself, right? The Wars, plural, which is an easy reading, but sometimes the easiest is also the most clear and most worthy of bringing up. But, right, that even though it's technically about World War I, it can also be a narrative about other subsequent wars. The fact that we were able to make connections with Vietnam and Afghanistan and so on kind of belies that point. So there is an element of futurity to these narratives.
Maybe I'm wrong on this, but I feel like never that which is shall die is like if it exists in history, it will always be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it comes back to our discussion earlier of postmodernism, right? It is there, right? And the fact of the war or the wars will always be. Okay? So it's really emphasizing its existence and its legacy. Okay? Even if our actual interpretation of the events changes. Okay? To take from another Greek philosopher whose name I forget, but the guy who was talking about the river, right, gets at that same idea that you can never step in the same river twice. Right?
It's Pocahontas, man.
It's Pocahontas. Right, but the idea that the river is always going to be there, right? The flow of history and time is always going to be there, but the individual atoms of that river is always going to change, or are always going to change and be different. Good. Anything else that we want to add on Euripides?
It's like this idea of hero worship,
Yep.
memorialization.
Yeah. A couple classes ago, when I was talking about the example of statues, right? That's a good example. We memorialize certain things because we want them to be immortal. Right? The statue, in this case, whether it's one that we like or not, doesn't really matter, is a physical representation of this idea of keeping something literally set in stone, or an idea of something as set in stone. I haven't seen a lot of statues in Brandon. I don't know if they're there, so I don't know who you're memorializing, if anyone, but maybe you should have one for Tommy Douglas. He was pretty cool. But right? But just any historical figure, right? If we have a statue of them, we want to keep them in this image. Yeah, go ahead.
The memorial Vimy is, I mean, it's very moving, obviously, but I know that Hitler went to see it and he really liked it.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about Vimy is that it's got these beautiful statues on it, like these perfect humans, very Ubermensch looking people.
Yeah. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. For those of you who want, is there like, yeah, I guess we'll take this one.
Especially those two on the front there.
Yeah. For those of you who've never seen it, this is what is there a way to zoom this in? Okay. Anyway, you get the point. In this case, not only set in stone, but the two statues that you were talking about, emphasizing that human cost that's literally propping up this kind of giant edifice. It's meant to be awe-inspiring and crushing, right, on an emotional level.
Where is this one?
This one is in France, although there's a few in different places, I think. I think there's a version in Canada, but I couldn't tell you exactly where. Like an equivalent. But
the main one.
Yeah,
well,
that main one is in
it's
France.
Canada, but it's inside of France.
Sure, exactly. It's like technically a part of, but yeah, in France, geographic France, in a place called Findley. And the reason why I brought it up is like it was a famous, or it became a famous battle that Canadians participated in World War I, or the site of a famous battle. Now it's mostly a field and this. I say that flippantly. It's still like an awe-inspiring statue.
Like the trenches are still there.
Yep.
Walk through them.
Yep. Yeah, there is something. Again, whether it's a statue, the fact of keeping the trenches is also a really evocative image in that sense. When I was, I'm just thinking of it because we brought up the Vietnam War. But when I was in Laos, this would have been 7 years ago, just before COVID, they still have areas where you can't go because there are still mines or potential minefields. But there are also places where you can literally see still craters, right, from when it was bombed out of existence. Right? For those of you who don't know, Laos is still to this day, I think, the place that has the most had the most bombs per person dropped on them, because a lot of the Viet Cong would use it territorially as a place to move back and forth, and the Americans found out and so annihilated that country. And so you can still see the craters just going around because it's a very poor country and they didn't necessarily fix it or have the resources to modify it. Or, tying into our discussion here, it does serve as a rather powerful memorial of what happened before. Because a lot of them are in fields. You could pretty easily just shift the earth around it and cover it up. It doesn't require that much of an effort. So at some point, you do make a choice about keeping those, bombed out craters.
I mean, if there's still unexploded mines, then maybe you don't want to go too close.
Well, that too. Yeah, but you still, they manage to get some done, but it's also a question of it takes a lot of time to do that and to get resources.
There's still unexploded mines around Vimy too. Places you can't go.
Yeah. Yeah, every once in a while, there's an article that comes up. It's like, oh, this, French farmer or whatever, this Belgian farmer found a bomb in his field.
In his garden.
Yeah, in his garden. It's just like, oh, okay. They could have just exploded their village, but no. So yeah, you still get these, to use a fancy term, these palimpsests of war, right? Yeah. I'll keep that up for now. In such dangerous things as war, the errors which proceed from a spirit of benevolence are the worst. So von Clausewitz, for example, by the way, for people who didn't look him up, was a Prussian military man, apparently still very well known. So what does that tell us about the narrative that we're about to read? I would say that this one's more thematic than anything else. You're not allowed to answer because you read the entire thing, so you might have a bit more insight into it. But I think you still get some hint from the beginning. A spirit of benevolence. The errors which proceed from a spirit of benevolence are the worst. What does that set up as an expectation for us?
How are you supposed to know how smart I am if I can't?
So usually, I think it was you, Ebube, who brought up the idea of compassion. We want our soldiers to be compassionate, not necessarily shoot everyone on sight. I'm using the soldiers example. We want people to be compassionate, right?
I think it as like people who follow maybe ideals that were great, trying to follow their or stay in that their like shadow, have the potential to do really bad things again.
Okay, right. So kind of a variation on the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Kind of, or like just kind of like almost like copycat, like copying, like so, like let's say the KKK.
Okay.
Model
Sure, to
themselves
use that.
after the Nazis. You know what I mean? Like they're just kind of trying to follow the same mindset, and that is not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like because they're using that spirit of benevolence would be the Nazis, right? And yeah, I'm just gonna read that again.
Yeah, because wait, how are the Nazis? Yeah, I'm mixing.
Okay, so like,
how is that benevolent?
The Nazis and what they did was like terrible.
Yes.
And then in the spirit of what they did, the KKK are making mistakes, like the same kind of mistakes.
Okay. I think I see what you mean. So history repeats itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
But then how does benevolence come into this?
Well, depending on who's asking, yes, but like the benevolence. I mean, I think maybe I mixed up benevolence with malevolent, so that's my mistake.
There you go. Okay. Yeah, I think that's the point. Because benevolence is you're doing something out of the kindness of your heart.
Yeah, sorry about
that. Right. Okay. No, it's fine. That's why I was like, the Nazis, when you said the Nazis were benevolent, I was like, excuse me? No, okay, so good. So doing something, basically to paraphrase, when you make a mistake trying to do something out of the kindness of your heart, that's when those mistakes lead to the worst outcomes, right, is what Clausewitz is saying. Now, why does that matter? Or what kind of expectation does that set up? Right? To me, right, when I first read this, when I was an undergrad, it set up the idea of what the main character is actually going to go through, of course, right? But it also set up the idea that this was going to be a very cynical novel. Right? I don't think I'm actually right, or my younger self was actually right about that. I don't think it's that cynical. But at least it set that standard for me. Right? When you open up with a quote that says, in war, right, you shouldn't be kind, right? Because the mistakes are basically going to cost you a lot more than if you had just been doing your soldier's duty. You're in for a wild ride. That's what I got out of it. And very quickly, early on in the novel, you get a sense of who our main character is. Don't have to read very far to do that. Right? You have this idea of Robert as a rather kind figure, right, from the start. And we'll get into this after the break, but especially in relation to his sister or to other members of his family, you don't get a sense that, based on the quote, things are going to end well necessarily for Robert. I keep calling him Rupert. Robert. Does that actually play out? You'll have to finish the novel to find out, or we'll talk about it tomorrow. But again, it comes back to expectations. And to fully cap off this first half of class, it comes back to this idea of narratives and their power. Right? Because remember, much like Lorena Gale was playing with expectations of slavery, right, and what slavery was like in Canada, Findley is playing with expectations of a war narrative. Right? And then he's telling you, also, let me manage those expectations with this quote. So you have, as a person who's living in 1977, picking this book up for the first time, certain ideals about World War I. Maybe I'm going to change them, maybe I won't. Then you read the quote and you kind of already start to question, right, whether or not he's going to play with those expectations, or at least how he's going to play with those expectations. At the very least, he's telling you grave mistakes are probably going to be made. And he's right. Grave mistakes are made. This is not a spoiler. Similar also to Angélique, it kind of tells you from the start almost what to expect by the end. Right? If errors which proceed from a spirit of benevolence are the worst, right, it kind of projects you towards the end. Right? In the same way that Angélique's opening speech in her play also projected towards the end. Now, again, your question becomes, is that actually going to pay off in the way that I think it's going to pay off? Or is Findley smarter than that? Or is there a power in the expectation? Read on to find out. After the break, we will... I'm not going to continue on this joke. So, long story short, always read the epigraphs. Tells you a lot about the story you're about to read. I feel like the more I talk to people who aren't in literature and I give them these ideas of, this is how you read, or this is what to look for. Am I ruining literature for some people? No. Because sometimes I do have that fear. And it's like, once you peek behind the curtain in that sense, it removes some of the magic. But, okay, good. I'm glad that you're all shaking your head no. So that removes a load off of my mind. All right, it's 7:30. I've been blabbing on for long enough. When we, take a few minutes, get some water, go get a coffee, whatever. When we come back, we're going to look at specific passages from the wars, especially the first half. Come to me if you have any questions.
The more I think about it, I think about Oppenheimer.
Oh, yeah.
You had a good idea. It was ended up being a terrible thing.
That's actually a really good... I say actually as if you don't come up with good ideas, but that's a really good connection. I guess as good of a place to get back into the class as we can. For how many of you have seen the movie Oppenheimer or know anything about him? Okay, so to make a long story short, right, part of at least the way that he has presented himself to history, and that we've chosen to believe him, is that the atomic bomb, much like the Gatling gun and dynamite before it, were supposed to be the ultimate deterrent of war. right? The thing to end all wars. If everyone has the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, or even if one person, if the possibility of a weapon of mass destruction on a most literal level exists, then no one will fight. Spirit of benevolence, right? I'm going to create this thing that is going to stop us from annihilating each other. Famously, that didn't work out, right? There's been an increase in how many wars have happened since then, or at least on the death toll level, certainly. So, yeah, actually, that's a really good example. Spirit of benevolence that led to grave mistakes, and basically now, how many atomic bombs are there in the world? Hundreds? Thousands at this point? I don't know.
And how many are missing?
How many are missing? How do you lose a bomb? Right? That's always baffled me whenever I found out, like, oh yeah, atomic bombs are missing. How? Anyway, okay. So you spent an hour and a half on 2 pages. Classic. But to add a little bit of structure to this class, so I brought up a couple of questions, less to stick firmly on them, but they're more of like guiding principles. Okay, we can take any one of these questions or ideas and have a productive conversation with any of them, really. And a lot of them, I would say, yeah, I think a lot of them would actually be possible even if you have only read a little bit of the text. Okay, just to get us all set up, does any brave soul want to summarize as succinctly as possible more or less what happens to our main character and the story in general in the first half? In like 5 sentences or less. The broadest of lines possible. So more or less the first 100 pages, which is exactly halfway through. So usually when we say summarize, we're talking about things like main characters, setting, events. So let's start with obvious. Who's the main character? Robert. Good. We'll come back to Robert and what he's like, because I think that's par for the question par excellence that Findley is asking us to consider. So next thing, setting. What would we say are some of the settings that we see in the first half? So if you've read the first 2 pages, you have 1 setting-ish, 1.5 settings. Time or place is setting.
Is that the 1930s?
So it would be a little bit before the 1930s. When was World War I on the most basic level?
1916 to 18.
A little bit before that.
14 to 18.
Okay, so there's that. And we mentioned earlier that the narrator is presumably some kind of historian or archivist. When are they writing from? Do we have a sense of that? What? Oh, sorry, I thought you had said something.
Sure.
We're not sure, but we do get hints. We do get some sense, I think. The future, certainly from the war. She or they are not writing from a contemporary perspective. Okay, since they have pictures, right, printed pictures, transcripts, archives, and so on. Right, so sometime in the later part, okay, you may have not gotten to that point, or you may not have picked up on it in one of the transcripts by Lady Juliette Dorsey, right, who's one of the people who's interviewed in that transcript, presumably happening in the contemporary moment when the narrative is written. She mentions that she's in her 70s at that point. Okay, and since she was a young teenager during the war, we can assume then, by just broad math, that the narrative itself is sometime in the 70s. Again, Findley kind of pointing very explicitly to the novel as a historical text, since the novel itself, I'll remind you, was written in the mid-70s. Okay? So yes, on the time scale, it is both then and now.
Now is then.
Now and now is, yeah, exactly. Then is now, whatever. It goes on and on and on. The fact that it takes place in the 1970s, I don't think really matters, only insofar as it points to the fact that the novel that you are holding is a historical text in and of itself. Okay? But technically, it could be at any point in time, and it would have that same effect. Okay? Yeah, we'll say 70s, probably, honestly, 1977. It wouldn't be that much of a stretch to say that. Okay. So we do get, so the archivist presumably, or the historian is, right? Arguably, that's where the book starts, is in some kind of archive or some kind of historical office. What other settings do we have in the novel so far?
I have Robert and the horses, so I don't think it's super clear exactly where he is in that chapter.
No, so we start off at the end, basically, right? For those of you who haven't gotten to the end, that first part is describing where Robert's going to end up, although we have no context for that just yet. We don't know, you're right, where exactly that is, or what exactly the implications of that scene are. Okay? So, when Robert's narrative begins proper, where does he begin? What's his life like in the beginning? Before he goes off to war, his sister is still alive. Spoilers, like 20 pages into the text. Like, it's not that far in. But where is he? What's his life like at the beginning?
In Canada, wealthy.
Yeah, good. So, his family estate, we can say that broadly. That's the worst R I've ever written. There we go. We'll say the Ross estate, which says quite a bit about Robert as a character. Okay? Not a particularly working class, man of the people type of character. Okay? He would have been, upper middle class type of thing. Maybe even lower upper class. Yeah, whatever. Some kind of upper class person. Right? Well-to-do, we would call today. Obviously, class distinctions at the time were a little bit different, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, good. I would say there's maybe two more important ones that we can bring up.
Tell a lot about his character based on his relationship with his sister.
Yes, we'll come to that in a sec. I just want to finish up the idea of setting, and then we'll, So there's two more settings that we can maybe bring up. There's the, how would you call it? There was a term for that where he, I guess, training camp, right?
Lethbridge?
Yeah, there you go. Lethbridge, Alberta, where a lot of people ended up, right? It was kind of a stopping ground for a lot of drafted soldiers, or to be drafted eventually soldiers, and then sent out. So it was training ground, that type of stuff. And of course, you start to get some hints at, right, the European front. Broadly speaking.
The boat is pretty big.
Yeah, I guess you could say the boat. That's true. Good. That's inevitably a difficulty with any novel, whether it's a short one or a long one. You're going to miss some details. We can't, unfortunately, talk about everything, but yes, I think the boat is important. Okay. So, in essence, to answer that first question, right, what happens in the first half on the most basic level, we get an archivist looking into Robert, and through that kind of framing device of her, I don't know why I imagined the archivist as a her.
It says her.
It says her at some point? Okay, then I forgot.
Like on the last page.
On the last page, okay. Yeah, I reread the text before today, obviously. I didn't prepare just the first half of the book. Yeah, so that's true. Her. Anyway, so the archivist frames the narrative, and then we go back. Basically, that's probably where you had a little bit of confusion, right? Who and when we were taking place, because the novel doesn't follow some kind of linear timeline. Okay, so and it doesn't even say, right, I am now looking at a picture. It's just going from chapter 2, you begin at the archives, and then chapter 3, the year itself looks sepia and soiled, muddied like its picture. So you're looking at a picture from one chapter to another, right, or one section to another. So you just kind of have to parse it out, right? But generally, there are 3 framings. Either you're following the archivist, you're looking at a picture, or it's someone telling you what Robert is going through, right? There are some exceptions, but those are the generally 3 modes that the novel is operating under. So what happens in the first half? You meet the archivist, then you zoom into the past where you get Robert's life immediately before he gets shipped off to war, and as he goes into the field of war. Okay? In the most basic sense of narrative, it's less of a timeline and more you can follow, right, your classic rising action, falling action that you probably have heard in high school. So at the point where we're talking about today, we're more or less halfway through the book, and everything is set up by the end of that first half. Coincidentally, it's also the half of the story, literally. Okay. And I was thinking of that actually. It was you, Brittany, who wrote your essay on the dialogue, right, between Thérèse and Angélique. That also happens pretty much halfway into the novel, almost to the page, right? And if ever you want a really easy literary analysis for longer text, not that it was an easy thing, but just like knowing going forward, you can look at the middle of a story, and it will almost always tell you what the most important thing about that story is, because it's usually the literal turning point. You only find out afterwards, right, that it's the turning point, but usually you see it quite often, right? Yeah.
I was just reading but sometimes being is it Toronto?
Is it Toronto or Alberta? So Lethbridge is where he trains, right? But yeah, the main family home is in Toronto. Yeah. It was just outside of Toronto, or was it in Toronto?
Talk about Young and Roar a lot.
Yeah.
So I would assume in Toronto.
Yeah. Yeah. So Toronto Mail and Empire and so on. Yeah. But yeah, generally speaking, sorry, just to finish off on that point, the kind of the structure of the story will usually also tell you a big indication as to what's important to the story itself. Right? And sometimes you can see that quite clearly. To take a really easy example, right? In that first Harry Potter movie, Harry Potter finds out that Voldemort is still alive halfway through the movie, right? Almost to the second, right? And it will inform the rest of the story, right? It is everything that the story was working up to, shifts, and everything afterwards, right, up to the final battle with, Baldy or whatever. Yeah, Voldemort is, comes afterwards, after that shift.
Well, the hinge, if you will.
The hinge, yeah. It's a literal hinge. Yeah. So sometimes we notice that in poetry with the comma that we spent a lot of time on in Armstrong's text, which happened almost halfway through. You don't usually see it in a lot of poetry. It doesn't follow as much this kind of turning point, but you do see it sometimes. Yeah. Anyway, so it might be worth actually examining where the novel ends off. If I stop ranting. Okay, so that's more or less what happens in the first half. The setting. So setting and its importance. So we mentioned that the Ross estate in the Toronto area. I don't know what Toronto looked like in 1914-ish. Probably not as dire as it does today. I'm sorry?
I think maybe with the love and the brand.
I think it was a little bit bigger, just population-wise, but it wouldn't have been that. It wouldn't have been that much bigger, mostly because a lot of the expansion that Toronto sees now, right, as this metropolis, happened actually right around the time that Findley is writing. Right? So you do see this kind of post-war boom, post-World War II, I should say, boom in Toronto. Although I think by 1914 it was still considered like a major city, but just not to the extent that it is today. Yeah. I'm not an urban historian, so I have no idea, right, if this is like, entirely factually correct or not. Okay, so the fact that Robert was raised on some kind of estate, as you were saying, very close to his sister, does give us some indications about him as a character. What do we know about him? What do we gather so far from the narrative? Even if you haven't read that far, you can get a hint by like chapter 2 or 3. Empathetic. Would you say he has a certain spirit of benevolence? Yeah. So I'll just say RR here. So yeah, empathetic. I'll just write them down and then we'll elaborate on these a little bit later. Okay, what else? What other qualities can we give Robert aside from empathy?
He's very what do you call it when you like push through something?
Driven?
Very, very driven and resilient.
Okay. For those of you who are answering, even if I didn't ask you, even if you haven't answered yet, be prepared to pull up some quotes to back up your claim about this. Hint, hint. What else? Coming back very quickly to our discussion of the hero, would we consider Ross a hero in the traditional sense of the term? Is like completely fearless Superman type, charging into battle with a Canadian flag on his chest instead of a S. That would be pretty awesome, but no, right. So he might have some of those qualities, right? Heroic-ish, right? But I wouldn't exactly qualify him as a categorically fixed hero, capital H. Right? I wouldn't put him in the same category as Achilles. Right? Fearlessly running into battle without a second thought, saving the brave maiden, the helpless maiden, or whatever.
He's not seeking glory the same way
Exactly.
that Achilles is.
Good. The part of that is cultural, right? Achilles was seeking glory because that was like a Greek standard at the time. But also
earlier when you used Achilles as an example of a hero, I never really thought of him as a hero because he was vain and he just wanted to be in history, so he cared about being famous. I thought Hector in that story was more of a hero because he's fighting for his family, protected his brother, the city, etc.
Yeah, Hector definitely aligns more with our contemporary ideas of hero. Achilles is more in line with what the Greeks would have considered the hero at the time, right? Mostly because it wouldn't have been seen as bad at the time for him to flaunt it, right, and want that. It would have been a drive more than anything. Okay, good. Is there anything else that I wrote down? Yeah. I think there's something else that we can add to Robert's character that you mostly get in his relation to the women in his life, his sister, his mother, arguably the sex worker, right? That you do get some kind. It's an extension of empathy, but it's not the same thing. What we would broadly call sensitivity. It's not sensitivity. Sensitive. Which, of course, ties into a wider issue that the text has with masculinity, right, and what that means at the time in the early 20th century. There's a lot to say about the scene in the brothel. Mostly because of what it says about all of this put together. We can almost use that as a case scenario for the entire section. Okay, so Moon, you're the one who brought up the empathy part. Back up your claim.
This is not exactly the peak of empathy, but like the conversation around the rabbits.
Okay, good. Give us a chapter. So it's part 1. 7. So for those of you who are following, part 1, chapter 7. In this copy, it's page 20. So very early on. Do you want to read it out? It's not very long.
Sure.
Use your booming theater voice.
Yeah. Why do the rabbits have to be killed? Because they were hers. But that can't possibly make any sense. Nonetheless, they must be killed. I'll look after them. Don't be ridiculous, Robert. Gracious, you're a grown-up man. Can't we give them away? Who to? 10 rabbits? Surely you can't be serious. What about Stuart? Why can't he look after them? Knowing Stuart, I can't imagine why you'd ask that question. I'll take care of them, please. Robert, control yourself. Silence. Who's going to kill them then? You are.
Okay. So the empathy part, I think it's minimized, but it's not absent, certainly, right? On the most basic sense of like, why would we kill these little fluffy bunny rabbits? Right? Which we still associate with cuteness and this life, literally, right? On the most symbolic level. We often associate rabbits with life. There's a reason why we have them as a symbol of Easter, which is life, of course. Screwing like rabbits, to put it in the crude sense. Good. Was that pretty much what you were focusing on, or did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Well, now that you have talked about that,
yeah.
I guess his sister's death sort of intersecting with the rabbits.
Mm-hmm.
The rabbits are outliving her.
Yeah.
To kill the rabbits is, I guess, she's that sort of innocence is gone.
Yeah. There's a sense in which the rabbits become symbolic of two things, right? On the one hand, they're most literally symbolic of Rowena, right? She was the one who was taking Rowena being Robert's sister, for those of you who haven't read that far. So Rowena had rabbits. Rowena dies because she has a medical condition, and she falls and dies. Okay? And so because she's dead, therefore the symbol or that stand-in for her must also die. Right? And they're a symbol on the most literal level. They are pure, right, animals, things that you need to take care of. Right? I don't know if any of you have ever had bunny rabbits. They don't survive much in the wild, right? At least not the domesticated bunny rabbits that we have now. Okay? Which says a lot about the perceptions of women that we had, of course, at the time. Right? But also, Rowena is someone who, at the time, especially considering medical practices, right, wouldn't have had much of a grandiose life. Right? She was wheelchair bound. Oh shoot, what's the name of the condition that she has? Hydrocephalus? Yeah. Right, which basically means like having an excess of fluid in your head, right? Which is still a thing today, of course. It's not one of those things that we've cured. Yeah.
I was kind of just going for like describing Robert. Like maybe I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but like it sounds like he could be effeminate. Like like that's like one gets societal norm of what masculine is.
I used the more appropriate term now, sensitive. But at the time,
I didn't know if that was appropriate.
No. I think the novel wants you to think that, definitely. Right?
I haven't read anything, just kind of what I'm looking at. Like, the best preview of all time for me right now. So.
Is there a double letter in effeminate at some point? It's 2 F's? Yeah. Effeminate. When you have to write a word that you never write in your life. Okay. Nothing makes you feel less intelligent than when you have to do a spelling bee for anything. Okay. Yeah, but we'll come back to the effeminate nature here. That is, I think, especially, it's kind of muted or assumed on some level throughout the narrative, and it comes to a head at the end of the text, I would say. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, so we can actually stay with chapter 7 for a second. I guess part 7. Aside from the empathy that Robert... just to finish on that point. So it demonstrates, of course, Rowena, right, symbolic of Rowena, but also, of course, as you were saying, Robert's empathy. So there are some things that sometimes represent two aspects, or can stand in for two aspects. And because it is both associated with Rowena and Robert, right? If the bunnies die because of Rowena, therefore a part of Robert must also die, right? On a literal thematic level. Which is why it's so difficult for him to actually go out and do the act of killing a bunny rabbit. Not only because what's the purpose, right? The novel is quite clear about that, right? Why would you want to kill these bunnies? They're just living, breathing things that can easily be taken care of. But also because on a more thematic and symbolic level, he would be killing a part of himself, right? By killing the only remaining thing that he has left living that's associated with his sister, who he had a very loving relationship with, or at least a strong relationship with. Good. This is as good of a passage as any. What else do we learn about this world in this passage? So we learn about his mother, right? I didn't bring her up in the questions, but yeah, absolutely. Mrs. Ross, extremely cold woman. Except that kind of is played with later. She gets very... You get a sense that she's putting on a certain act, right? You don't quite get it here because it's so matter of fact. But then based off of her reactions later to Robert going off to war, you understand that there is a little bit of societal pressure to enact a certain kind of role. Right? In case it wasn't clear, this is the kind of novel that benefits from a lot of rereadings, right? Because you understand things afterwards. Right, so here she's cold. Later, the facade kind of drops. So that's absolutely true. What else? There's still more. especially in that like middle sentence that starts, "Don't be ridiculous, Robert." There's a lot that's implied in that one. "Don't be ridiculous, Robert. Gracious, you're a grown-up man."
So she's already condemning him for having empathy. Because
Yeah.
it's not manly.
Good. So it comes back to the effeminate point, but also, right, overall societal standards. Right? Not only does it affect his mother, right, who has to, as a mother, ensure that her little boy grows up to be a proper man in Edwardian, late Victorian society, right? But also it has an impact naturally on him. Good. You looked like you were going to add something.
Just this line, knowing Stuart, I can't imagine why you would ask that question of him taking care of them.
Yeah.
Which I can say so much about, but I don't want to spoil
No, exactly. Right. No, but it does say a lot about, again, just how these standards are perpetrated, right? Like, don't be ridiculous. Right? I've heard that so many, speaking for myself, right? I've heard that so many times of actually just being an English major. In case you haven't noticed, there's a lot more women in this type of class, right? And I know you're all taking it as an elective, but just also in the department in general, there are typically more women. And the number of times that I've been called effeminate because I'm in the English department, right? Why don't you do like the job of a real man, like, I don't know, like a mechanic or something like that, right?
The whole concept of male flight, right?
Yeah.
Women enter a field and suddenly it's not cool anymore.
It's not cool anymore, but also like, what are you doing an artsy, like?
But it used to be all men.
Yeah. Used to be. But again, these ideals or societal standards, right? And again, I don't think the people who were saying that were necessarily ill-intentioned. Sometimes they were, but necessarily ill-intentioned, but a lot of them would have just taken it for granted. Why wouldn't you do something a little bit more masculine coded? And to use more contemporary terms. Right? In case it wasn't obvious, I would not be the type of person who would be able to go to war for things like this. Okay. And of course, that's emphasized later with the control yourself. Right? This kind of management of emotions is par for the course at the time. Which is, to come back to Oscar Wilde very quickly, that was one of the things that was problematic about him, right? And what people were focusing on in their condemnation of him as a homosexual was the fact that like his more feminine side was coming out, right? These flights of fancy that were considered less masculine, right, and reserved. Okay? So even if Wilde would have died 15 years before Robert's existence in the context of this novel, those societal mores are definitely still prevalent. Okay. Mel, you brought up the idea of driven. Do you have a passage to...
Section 1, chapter, I guess, 20. Longboat, Robert's hero, was an Indian. He ran the marathon. He won things. Then he smiled and was silent. Robert smiled and was silent too. He'd go upstairs into the attic when he was 10 and take off his clothes in front of an old, dark mirror and wish that he was red or black or yellow or any color but pink. Smiling and silence didn't seem to go with pink. One night, later on when Robert was 12, he decided he would run the marathon himself, 26 times around the block, down through the ravine and back along the sidewalk, running in his bare feet. He did this after supper one night, while his father watched from the porch and counted off the laps. 26 times, on top of liver and bacon and scalloped potatoes. Oh, tomatoes. What? Scalloped tomatoes.
Yeah.
I read potatoes the first time. I don't know what to do with that.
I think that's a great desire for it not to be tomatoes, because that sounds awful.
First time I'm asking this, but is this a true story?
Tom Longboat?
Well, I know Tom Longboat is. That's why I was wondering if the novel itself was.
So he would have.
That's why it made me wonder. Like,
I googled it.
I've heard of Tom Longboat, and then
Yeah.
like he would run messages because he was ready to get marathons.
So Findley would have been he would have been the archivist in this scenario, right? He would have been aware, and he would have either talked to people who were in the war or had access to some archives, but it's not one specific story that influences.
Like Robert Ross isn't real.
No, at best he's a coalition war. That's not coalition. There's a better term for that I'm not thinking of.
Compilation.
Yeah, what was the term? Not analog. Yeah, I guess composition. But anyway, bringing together of all kinds of different narratives.
Anthology.
Yeah,
But
hey, I'll think of it. But yeah.
That's cool that he used a true like historical figure.
Yeah.
This part.
Yeah, which is par for the course for historiographic metafiction, and then we'll finish that passage. It's par for the course for historiographic metafiction of at least grounding it in some historical facts, right, that you can point to and grab onto, so that any variations on it will either feel natural, right, and part of this world that we're familiar with, or clash for the purposes of storytelling. Right. And emphasis. Yeah. Sorry, please.
On top of liver and bacon and scalloped tomatoes. This was unwise. Mrs. Ross and Ina the maid both said so. He will die, they said. 26 times on top of supper. Surely he's mad. But Tom Ross said, no, let him. This is what he wants to do. In the end, by the 24th lap, the porch was crowded with all the Rosses, Bimbo the dog, Ina the maid, and Charles the gardener, cheering. People even came out onto their lawns along the street and waved and called out, keep going, don't give up, and that's the spirit, Robert. Then Robert fainted, just at the end of the 25th lap. Fainted and was down with jaundice.
Yeah. So
the fact that he would keep running until he passed out.
Yeah. Running until he passed out. But also this creation of heroes, right, that to live up to, right? This is like heroes in the positive sense. And there would be, I'm sure if you've read far enough, you'll notice that there are other heroes that he would create for himself. Taffler, for example, is certainly a hero, his commanding officer, at least a person in Lethbridge. And the actions of Taffler are, again, in the brothel, are arguably one of those things that start to break down Robert's image of heroes, right, and what heroes are supposed to be. But the choice of Tom Longboat, I think, is a very interesting one. Obviously, he was a very popular figure at the time. He was well respected, even if Longboat died in obscurity, unfortunately. Right? But there is this distancing that's happening. Right? On the one hand, as far as we know, Robert never met Tom Longboat. Right? And so it's easier to create this image, right? He's my hero because I get the filtered version of him from the newspapers. Right? Or maybe I saw him run at the Boston Marathon. I don't know. Which was a thing at the time. But of course, it allows him to also imagine himself as a physically different person. Right? In case you didn't catch that, that's what he means when he's saying, wish that he was red or black or yellow, right? Red in this case refers to the racial stereotype of Indian red, right? Or black or Asian yellow, any color but pink, which of course has one connotation, right? Pink skin, but also what other connotation? Yeah. Effeminate. I don't know when that transition. I know for a bit, right? It was reversed, or it wasn't as much of a thing of like the blue and pink. I remember hearing about that like before it just people wore whatever because they had to, right? And then I think it was around this time or just after the Depression that it started to flip, where it became a little bit more of a standard that women or girls wore pink and boys and men wore blue. But I can't remember when exactly that shift happened, but I'm like 99% sure that it's right around this time. Good. Scalloped tomatoes. Ugh. Yeah.
Maybe it's a
Okay.
typo.
Yeah, it's a typo. After so many additions, they never caught scalloped tomatoes.
Because people see it and they read potato. They
Yeah.
don't even think about it.
It also, I do kind of like that though. Like all jokes aside, I do. It gives you it's one of those snapshots that gives you just a hint of what life was like at the time. Right? Without explaining, he never explains what scalloped tomatoes was. Maybe it was a standard at the time. Maybe it was already still by the 70s. I'd have to ask my parents. Right? Has my mom ever eaten scalloped tomatoes? But it's just a good example of how it sets the world up in the same way that Tom Longboat is not explained at all, right? Who he is. And it's just assumed to be a part of this world.
Toronto's poutine.
Yes.
Just didn't take off.
Toronto's poutine is devastating as a takedown. Next time I'm in Toronto, I'm going to tell that to a Toronto person and just watch them melt in front of me.
The internet, I don't know if I can trust this, but the AI overview,
Sure.
which I hate, but anyway,
Yeah.
it says the 1940s is when pink became
Okay.
color for girls, but before that it was a stronger color for boys. So then, would it be a bit anachronistic to say that he was wishing to be anything but pink?
But in this case, he's most certainly referring to his skin color, of course.
But to say that thinking of that as being effeminate, that would be anachronistic.
Yeah. So it's either anachronistic insofar as we're reading too much into it, or it's part of Findley's playing with history that, in the same way that Loretta Gale is putting in references to OJ or current affairs, he's also playing with assumptions about what you expect of the time.
Yeah.
I can't speak beyond that. I don't know what his intention was on a line-by-line basis for this.
Scalloped tomatoes actually sounds good. Tomatoes and breadcrumbs and butter.
Tomatoes, breadcrumbs. Okay, so
It's
it is
like
like
a-
scalloped potatoes. Yeah. Okay.
Kind of.
There's no breadcrumbs in scalloped potatoes. It's like cream and cheese.
That's true.
Popular in North America in the late 1800s.
Okay, so that's interesting. In the late 1800s, right? It says a lot also about the family and...
It said it was a way to use up stale bread and summer tomatoes.
Yeah, okay, so that doesn't surprise me entirely that it's a way to use up stale bread. But it's, again, if it's something that was popular a couple decades prior to when the narrative takes place, right, it does say a little bit about the family's values, right? That they are kind of beholden to some old-fashioned, not only by their status, right, as upper class, which tends to be the last kind of bastion to change with the times, just historically speaking, but also just the food is somewhat indicative of that. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. All right. Good. Empathy-driven. Right. So, any other points or any other passages that we wanted to highlight? Otherwise, I was going to go to the brothel scene. Okay. Now, where does the brothel scene take place? No, it's fine. Go ahead.
I don't know what you said.
Brothel?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a place of sex workers.
Yeah.
Starts on
That's what I heard.
You're not wrong.
115.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of you who for the benefit of those of you who are catching up. So just outside of the training camp, there is a brothel. Okay, and it's basically exactly as you would expect, right? Filled with sex workers, which is not entirely out of the realm of what you see in real life, right? Both historically and still today in the field of war. So already the setting does say a lot about the theme, right? The association of the performance of a certain kind of masculinity in fighting. Right? You have to remember that at this time in the war, there was no conscription. Right? There would be conscription much later in the war. In Canada, it would appear in 1917. But by then, at the beginning of the war, there wasn't conscription. So it was entirely volunteer-based. Right? So you have that kind of drive, to use your term, to go out and prove, right, you're a man, you can fight for your country or, the British Empire and its incredible values. And of course, the explicit tying that on a geographic level to a place where you can enact your sexual fantasies. Right? This is not a revelatory reading. I'm just making explicit what I think the novel is already trying to say. But something really interesting happens, two things, actually, that are really worth noting happen in the brothel. I don't even know if brothel is the appropriate term anymore. I've never used sex workers in my life. I don't know what the appropriate terms are.
It's a brothel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whorehouse, to use that term in the book or whatever, but yeah, brothel.
Bathhouse.
Bathhouse is slightly different, although it is related. Okay. So yeah, on 17 specifically, so Robert goes, and there's a sense in the book that he's kind of pressured into going. Right? His chums in the war kind of like, come on, Robert, let's go get some tail or whatever.
You do or you don't, and if you don't, you face a kind of censure most men would rather avoid.
Yes, exactly. Interesting use of censure here. You face a censure that most men would like to avoid. Yeah. So he goes to this place, ends up in a room with a woman, Ella. And what happens, for those of you who have gotten that far? To put it crudely, he can't get it up. Right? There's an anxiety, literally, about performing. Okay? And let's see. This is on page 39, so part 17 for me. For those of you who are following along. Looks at Ella, this is what I'm paid for to make you happy, okay? But how? Robert wanted to ask, except he didn't know how to put that into words. Nothing he'd read had covered this situation. Whores, of course, had been discussed at school, but no one actually ever said, this is what you do. Right? They'd all made it up. But what they'd made up was not like this at all. They'd flown from trapezes and made love in bathtubs and ravished several women tied to the bedposts. But no one had ever sat in a room with lilac wallpaper and been asked if there was nothing special you'd like. So surprisingly, again, playing with our expectations, right? The expectations of young boys, right? Bragging about things that they've never done, which, as a former young boy myself, I could say is absolutely legitimate and is a shameful part that all little boys go through. But also, right, there's this sense that there's a kind of shock when actually faced with some kind of intimacy. That was an odd way of phrasing that. Intimacy. There we go. Is there anything special you'd like? It's a simple question, right? And yes, she's paid for it, right? That's the nature of sex work. But just coming face to face with that simple question just completely destroys Robert's expectations of what being in a brothel performing your masculinity is going to be like. And to make a long story short, right, they don't end up doing much of anything, right? As the next page indicates, right, Robert lay back with his arm across his eyes, right? Ella performed her task with efficiency and tact. Nothing was said about what had happened. Even when Robert blushed, she had looked away in order to smile. The entire act, right, however long it takes, is 3 1/4 lines long. Right? No emphasis on it, right? It's not meant to be romantic at all, right? It is as efficient as Ella. Look, I'm using the terms of the text in this case, come on, right?
I don't know if her task is actually. I think she just cleans them up.
Yeah, she clean. But that's true because he ejaculates before. That's true. He doesn't even do the task. Yeah, or at least not in the conventional sense. She's still efficient.
Poor Robert.
But poor Robert, not only that, right? On the one hand, you are supposed to feel sympathetic for him, of course, right? But again, at this point in the novel, Findley's still setting up his project, right? Of tearing down this heroic figure, right? Or what you would assume is a heroic figure. In a conventional novel in the early 20th century, there would be way too long of a passage on how Robert had an incredible sexual stamina, right? Dude was laying pipe, just again,
With multiple women.
With multiple women, like every person in the brothel, whatever, right? Just absolute legend. But this is not what we're doing here, right? So on the one hand, yes, you feel sad for him, but I think it also comes with a sense of relief, right? That you're not actually facing the same story again and again, right? Go ahead.
So just to add on to this,
Yeah.
and your superhero theme, he's not Captain America and he can't do this all day.
No, it's true. Yeah, he can't do it all day. But how do we, to take another superhero, Iron Man, what's his whole thing? Right? The first thing we know about him in that movie is not that he's a superhero, is that every woman wants him. Right? Like he's somehow the most attractive man to ever wear lifts in his life, right? With an awful goatee. And yet every woman, right, just wants to be with him and every man wants to be him.
He's a billionaire.
Because he's a billionaire, he's handsome, he's whatever, he's smart, right? He's handsome in like a very specific 2008 way in which men were handsome, and like you can never pull that off ever again. I've tried, but I've tried that goatee. Doesn't work. It only works on Robert Downey Jr., and you'll never convince me otherwise. Right? But okay, so on the one hand, Robert fails sexually. In seeking intimacy, arguably. But there's something else that happens in that brothel scene. And I'm looking for... Yeah, so it's at the end of that same chapter, actually, on 17. Okay. Where do I begin? Okay, so I'm not going to read the entire passage because it's many paragraphs long. But the basic idea is that Captain Taffler, is in the next room. Right? And you hear the noises that you would expect to hear, but not quite right, quote unquote. Right? There's something that makes it so that Robert is curious, and he peeks through a hole in the wall into the next room to find that Taffler is having a homosexual relationship with a person who they only call the Swede. Right? And the way that it's described is rather intense and violent. Right? In many ways, it is the fantasy that Robert was told about. Right? The sound and breathing. The sound of breathing and of bed springs. The rider held the reins in one hand and, using a soldier's stiff peaked cap, beat the horse on the thighs, one side and then the other. Right? It's violent and it's animalistic and so on and so forth. It's very powerful, is what you're supposed to get from this. But also, that's the reveal at the end of the chapter, is that it's with another man, which, in the terms of the time, inevitably make it somewhat effeminate. Actually, not somewhat, very effeminate. Right? And so suddenly this hero that Robert had in Taffler shifts. Right? Suddenly this peak of masculinity, this man who's supposed to be driven and literally the hero in the traditional sense of the term, is warped. It doesn't quite fit what Robert thought or expected a man to be. Some people have read this as Robert's own curiosity with sexuality, right? In associating a person that he admires so much with a homosexual relationship. Maybe, right? I think there's not necessarily enough in the novel to back that up fully, considering that Robert has relations with another woman later, right, in the novel. I think it's a little bit less cut and dry than that might imply, but it's still worth considering at the very least that the questioning is there, right, of what exactly it means or it entails to be a sexually active man in this world. Okay? And of course, its association with war. Good. There is, of course, one thing that we should mention, which ties into the rabbits that we talked about earlier, right? Although not explicitly about rabbits. So if you turn to, for me it's 42, 43, but if you turn to that end of chapter 17, when I said animalistic, what kind of animal is being referred to here?
Horse?
Yeah, good, horse. So not just once, but twice in less than 50 pages are people explicitly associated with animals. Okay? To put it bluntly, this is not what we call a coincidence. Okay? And that segues us pretty nicely into the question that I put up here, which is what kind of rhetorical devices does the narrator use to tell the story? So on the one hand, the use of metaphor is one of them. Right? Displacing meaning onto something else. Right? Metaphor, or creating a comparison. In this case, between two men having sex and a horse and a rider. Right? Whereas earlier we had talked about Rowena and Ross both coming into different levels of representing rabbits, right? Or the rabbits, I should say, representing Rowena and Ross. So obviously this is not a subtle way of doing it, but it's okay. I'm not criticizing the novel for that, but as evidenced by this cover, right, on one of the editions of the Wars, this is something that the novel really wants you to think about, right? The relation to animals. So on the one hand, we have in this scene the horse as a sexual, right, like Italian stallion type of thing, right? Literally, right? The joke, right? Sylvester Stallone, for those of you who don't know, started off in a career in pornography, and that was his name, the Italian stallion. There's a reason, right? We imagine horses as powerful, powerful, muscular, having other certain endowments, right? So on the sexual level, it works. How does it tie into the war level? Right? Let's create that connection, even if it is obvious for you. Why would it be so prevalent in a war narrative? So on the one hand, right, this is something that's changing, right? Famously, there were still battalions that were using horses at the time, and it happens in this. But we're starting to see the increased mechanization of war at the same time, right? Use of tanks, use of machine guns, etc., and so forth. Okay? It's not quite World War II levels, but they're starting to get replaced. So there's a sense that, yes, you have the workhorse, right, as something that's warlike and powerful, but also a little bit antiquated. Okay. Anything else?
The horses are crammed onto the boat the same way that the soldiers are crammed onto the boat.
Yeah. In the way that so there's the cramming on the boat is a perfect image, right? The way that we are treating these soldiers in a way that's dehumanizing. Right? We can pack you in on a boat and ship you off across the ocean without a second thought, like we would a pig putting them onto a truck, right, to go be turned into bacon.
So the fish is that.
Yeah, it's like the fish in Steveston. Good. Very intentional connections. I say after the fact. Good. So metaphors and oh my God, is it already almost 9 already? Ah! I'm so sorry. I know I do this every class. I just get excited about certain things and this. Okay, so metaphor is one of them. What other kind of rhetorical devices? When I say rhetorical devices, I mean the way that we tell the story.
Just a lot of foreshadowing.
A lot of foreshadowing, such as.
I don't want to spoil.
I mean, you don't need to say where it goes, but you can give a hint to people who haven't read it as to things that will go somewhere. So horses, by the way, is one of them.
Yeah.
Sexuality is definitely one of them.
There's the candle.
Okay. So sometimes, again, it's not obvious that something is foreshadowed. The animals, you should be clicking in your mind to pay attention whenever there are animals because it's so condensed. Right? Candles is another one, right? Or specifically the flames.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you get a hint of this here and there, right? Towards the end of the first half, you get burn patients, for example. So you get this symbol of fire and its effects throughout, but it's more muted than the animal one, definitely. Any others that come to mind?
For foreshadowing? When he has to kill the horse on the boat.
Mm-hmm. Harkening back to the bunnies, of course, but also to what he will have to face in the actual theater of war. There's a few moments throughout the narrative where people constantly have to tell him, you have to do this, right? The rabbits, it's a bit unjustified. It's symbolic more than anything. The horse is a little bit more justified. Do you remember why they have to kill them?
He broke his leg.
Yeah. So the horse broke its leg. In the necessity, quote unquote, of war, you're not going to do anything with a horse with a broken leg. So it's ramping up. Sorry, I'll just finish my point and then it's ramping up, right, the situations in which Robert has to kill, right? Or at least that it's justified that he needs to kill. At first, there's the societal justification. Don't be a coward, right? Just kill your sister's bunnies. to a necessity. We're not going to do anything with a horse that has a broken leg. Giving you some insight into, well, once he's in the actual theater of war, what do you think is going to happen? Yes.
I haven't read any of this. I'm worried I'm going to be offensive either. Also, sorry, but like for foreshadowing, I feel like Findley is breaking down the typical hero and giving him the chance to the effeminate main character to maybe rise to some kind of occasion. And then like that, I don't know. I feel like that's the foreshadowing that might happen. Like I said, I haven't read it. So
yeah. The only reason that, I mean, would it be foreshadowing, or would it be? I guess it fits in with both in that sense. Once you've established that he's not your typical hero, that's where your expectation of the story goes. But of course, the overlap between foreshadowing and expectation is quite there. I guess foreshadowing would be what elements tell you that that's where it's going to go, right? And you can only know that once you finish the novel.
I would say that Taffler and the brothel is big
Yeah.
foreshadowing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Taffler and the brothel.
Yeah.
Okay. So what other devices, it can be framing devices, are used for telling a story? So there is the literal telling of the story, right? And the narrator saying, this is what I am doing now, or this is what Robert is doing now at this point in the story. But there are other ways that we brought up earlier that are interesting as well. And we'll probably have to cover them more in depth tomorrow. What other framing devices did we bring up earlier that are a way of telling a story as well, even if it is still text?
Switches different perspectives.
Perspectives, good. What are the other perspectives?
I can't remember. Juliet as a child.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lot like Atonement.
Oh, the Ian McEwan?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you do get other characters' perspectives. Good. Which, of course, again, decenters the idea of one heroic character who gets all the focus. Findley's not exclusive in doing this, but he's participating in a wider push to try to do that in fiction. So we can appreciate him for that, certainly. There's a section at the beginning that's rather exemplary of this as well. The novel switches between third person and second person sometimes as well. Right? So usually it's in third person when it's recounting a historical event, right, or a fabricated historical event, of course. Juliet did this, Robert was doing that, they did this, right? All of this is third person, typical story. And usually the archivist's thoughts, right, or when we're telling like that whole research process, it's usually in something like a second person. If we look just at chapter 1, you get a good example of this. Part 1, chapter 1. Towards the middle of it, what you have to accept at this outset is this. Many men have died like Robert Ross, obscured by violence. What you have to accept is this. At the outset is this. And you does a lot of heavy lifting in narratives like this, and you should always pay attention to it if you see it in a novel. It's so uncommon that it has to be a deliberate choice. And sometimes it switches from one series to another. My partner's been reading a kind of post-colonial classic called the Tsitsi Dangaremba text, Nervous Conditions. And that one, it was published in the late 80s. Very good text. That one's in first person, And then the sequel to it is in the second person. Right? Arguably, you're following the same characters, but the narrative completely shifts in tone as a result. Okay? So the use of you is always notable. Here, it's especially notable because you is doing double duty. The you is simultaneously the way in which the narrator refers to themselves, right? You should do this and do that, and blah, blah, blah. But especially in passages like the one that I just read, what you have to accept, the narrator is also looking directly at you, the reader, and saying, this is what you need to, this is the mindset that you need. If you're going to go any further in the text, you need to have some ground rules. Which is a powerful thing to do. We don't have time to necessarily unpack it, but it's something that you should be aware of. Right? Are you being interpolated, or are you in the mind of the narrator? Or both? Are you the narrator? Could be another answer to that, another question to ask about this, and is a classic of historiographic metafiction. Right? A lot of subsequent authors would also do that same trick. Yeah, chapter 3 is a good one, a good example of some rhetorical devices. The one that starts 1915, the year itself looks sepia and soiled, muddied like its pictures, blah, blah, blah. There's the rhetorical device of describing pictures. The pictures are not reproduced on the page. You are getting the archivist's interpretation and description of the picture. It's a form, here to use a fancy term, it's a form, but I wouldn't call it exact one-to-one. Of what we call in cultural studies ekphrasis, which is another Greek term. It basically means the description of an art object. Usually it's associated to paintings. So if a poet, famously Keats did this, right? His Ode to Aggression Urn is an entire poem that's him describing and the experience and visuals of looking at this urn. Right? So that would be a form of ekphrasis. You can argue that the descriptions of the old photographs, should have brought up an old photograph of the 1914. So, yeah, you can actually see it in these kinds of photographs, right? These kind of older, grainy pictures. These pictures that you don't necessarily imagine as art objects in the typical painting style. Right? But that are still inevitably composed in the sense of like framing a camera angle, preserved for historical value. You can learn a lot from a moment based on a picture, because we tend to forget this now that we can take like 60 million pictures a day, right? But you had to put a lot of effort into actually photographing something. Right? So even in the fog of war, setting up a camera to take a picture of that not only comes at immense cost and risk, but also just time and effort, right? What does it mean to preserve this moment of this soldier, this trench, this, event? Which is something that is unparalleled, by the way, in the history of war and would only increase. Famously, that's one of the things that would stop or lead to protests with the Vietnam era, is because people had unparalleled access to what was actually happening. Right? That begins at that time. Once you know what war actually looks like, and it's not mediated through, stories or, newspapers, suddenly all that romanticism is gone. because you see the bodies. Right? At the time, it still wasn't quite that level, right? They didn't really take pictures of that because you still had that dissociation. But it will lead up to this, certainly. So the photographs are a rhetorical move that you should absolutely pay attention to. Why were those photographs in particular preserved? Why are they being described to you? What is the effect of having a picture described to you rather than having it printed on the page? Because again, printing technology was good enough at the time that Findley could have just had a picture there, right? We'll probably rearrange the schedule since we're taking 2 classes on this, but Michael Ondaatje's Billy the Kid was published the year after this and does feature pictures, right? Like materially, you can do that at the time, but he's choosing not to. He's choosing to do an active emphasis. Why? I'm not actually looking for an answer right here and now. I'm asking it rhetorically. You can if you want, but you don't have to. Okay, there's one last passage that I wanted to bring up that kind of, I think, caps off everything that we've been saying today. This is on page 55, and then I'll let you go. So for those of you who are following, it says halfway through chapter 23. Chapter 23 of part 1. There's a really good passage where one of Robert's cabin mates is reading a children's, or a book, right? And that's why I'm bringing it up. One of Robert's cabin mates, the only inactive one, was Captain Ord. Blah, blah, blah. He claimed the privilege of having lost his voice and spent the voyage sitting propped against his pillow, drinking brandy from a silver cup and reading the works of G.A. Henty. What on earth are you reading that stuff for? Clifford asked him. God, I haven't seen those books since I was 12. Ord said hoarsely that since he was going to do a boy's work, he must read the stuff of which boys are made, and smiled. Clifford didn't appreciate the humor. So this is, I want to finish off on this because I think it encapsulates a lot of what Findley is doing as a project. Did anyone actually look up who G.A. Henty is? He's a real person. Yeah. He was a writer of boys' fiction, right? Like the Hardy Boys type of fiction. Right? Again, very topical reference. I don't know what modern boys' fiction is like. But a lot of his narratives were centered around young boys facing up war. So young boys during the Napoleonic War, young boys during, I don't know, the Civil War, right? Or the War of 1812, right? Et cetera, and so forth, right? And so they were kind of boys' young adventures, but they were also explicitly tied to the ideological underpinnings of what it meant to be at war, right? And what we expected young boys to learn about war. I only bring this up because not only does it tell us explicitly, right, what Findley is trying to do, but also as a reminder to pay attention to some of these references. While Robert himself is not a real person, a lot of these references are, and Findley is essentially making a historical collage, if you will, of why we associate war with the specific boys' works type of ideas. And in creating and emphasizing the narrativization of this history, he is also creating his own narrative that tells you why those narratives exist. It gets a bit head trippy if you think about it for too long, so we'll stop for today. Tomorrow, try to finish the book for those of you who haven't, or at least read a good chunk of it. And we'll finish up by focusing on how a lot of these foreshadowed elements that we talked about today pay off, okay, or come to a head. Try to find also some passages that you'll quote or bring to class, just so I don't have to read too much from them.